there's always the people that are very much like, yeah, this needs to change, totally on board with the change. There's some that are cautiously optimistic or like, I'll wait and see. And then there's some that are just dug in, entrenched, and this is terrible. Like, why are you changing my job? The things worked fine. You just kind of have to learn to work with all of them. And you can't roll your eyes at the skeptics or the people that are dug in. I've worked with some pretty challenging situations, but talking with them, there were some really, really good reasons why they were dug into the current way of doing things. And in some cases, I'll say they weren't even against change at all, but they were against the change as they perceived it. And so part of it is, in some cases, there's the ability to modify things a little bit and make it a little more palatable.
Welcome to the CX Equation, a podcast by TAP CXM.
We share actionable insights and real-world case studies to equip you with the tools you need to drive loyalty, engagement, and sustainable growth.
We're your hosts, Chantelle Casey
and Mark Clydesdale. On today's episode of the CX Equation, we've got Greg Kihlström joining us, consultant, advisor, author, speaker, and host of the award-winning The Agile Brand podcast. Greg has spent his career at the intersection of marketing, technology, and customer experience, advising some of the world's biggest brands while writing close to 20 books on the subject and hosting award-winning podcasts. His work spans everything from personalization and journey orchestration to marketing operations and data transformation, and he's become one of the go-to voices for leaders trying to make sense of how all of these pieces fit together. Greg, it's great to have you on. Welcome to the CX Equation.
Yeah, thanks so much. Looking forward to that conversation.
Sadly, my co-host Chantelle couldn't be here today, so you're stuck with just me, I'm afraid. But I love Agile, so hopefully we'll have a good chat. And I'm going to jump straight in and ask you, you've spent years helping organizations navigate change and improve how they're working, generally through Agile and agility. How did you first get into that space?
I started my career after a brief stint at a startup. I ran a marketing agency, particularly in digital experience, for a number of years. And what I found was I didn't know the word for it, but I knew that we needed to be nimble and yet not reactive. And so, from my standpoint, what I think Agile often gets there's a lot of definitions kind of floating around, and I think there's a lot of misunderstandings. But to me, what it means is to be able to take a data-driven approach to making better decisions and modifying an approach when it makes sense to do so, but not, again, being reactive and fly by night and all that stuff. And I think what I learned early enough in the agency days was we needed some fairly strict processes that guided our work, but we also, the world was changing. It was continually changing. It continues to change. And so we needed a process to be able to say, okay, are our processes working the way they used to last year? Do we need to modify those as well? And so to me, when I started learning more about Agile and adopting that, it really fit, because it not only are you working together in a better way of working with teams, but you're also taking a minute to look back and a retrospective and being able to say, well, how is the actual work getting done, and is it as effective as it was yesterday?
Yeah, I love a retrospective. And you sometimes have to say the retrospective isn't about looking at the results of the campaign or the initiative. It's looking at the process. It's looking at how well we were able to get the thing out there that we wanted to do, right? And how do we, it's that idea of continuous evolution and optimization, isn't it? So okay.
Yeah, it's the work about the work, they sometimes call it. Nice. We complain about it. Like many of us, myself included, have complained about, what we have to do, the repetitive tasks or whatever, but we rarely have the forum to do something about it. And so that's what I like about the retrospective as well, is it kind of separates the marketing campaign or the website or whatever it was that we were doing launched successfully or not, but how about how we work together as a team and all that.
So You're right. The word agile does get thrown around a lot. How can you tell the difference between a business that genuinely is agile versus one that's just using the word and saying it's agile?
Yeah, I mean, I think when a team or a company pivots a lot, I mean, that was the like startup-y phrase that was used a lot, still is a bit, but when a company pivots too much, too often, you're not really being. That's something else. That's maybe lack of direction or an ill-conceived strategy, or I. Not to throw anybody under the bus, but I worked for a company like that years and years ago, and they pivoted themselves to laying off 75% of their workforce. So, the back in the startup days or whatever. But so that's the wrong way of doing it, is just being reactive. Oh, okay, this isn't working. Let's change direction. Let's do something better, different, instead of being methodical and giving a test or an experiment enough time to either work or fail, but learning from that instead of just saying, oh, that doesn't seem to be working, let's move on.
Are there any particular misconceptions that you come up against time and time again?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's some of it goes down to just what is a true test of whether something's working or not, and I think this goes back to the scientific method. Some marketers that do a lot of testing, they know this stuff, but I'm always surprised at how few. I work a lot in the marketing space and some in the CX space as well. I'm always surprised at how few people really understand what a true test is. And you have to define your hypothesis or what you believe to be true before you start, not halfway through, and you can't revise that, 3/4 of the way through a test. Like, it's either true or it's not, right? And so I think, again, I'm sure they mean well and they're doing their best and they need to move quickly or whatever, but I think that's a misconception, is that you can kind of make it up as you go instead of being very scientific and methodical about this. And that doesn't feel agile, because it's like, okay, we've got to give this 2 weeks to run. A week and a half into that, it doesn't feel very agile to be waiting an extra 3.5 days for the test to run. But in the long run, you're going to thank yourselves because you actually did a test, you performed it, and you could tell what really worked and what didn't.
And I find with the test as well, yes, you need the hypothesis. You need to know how you're going to measure the result. But I always think it's good in the early stage as well to think about what is the action you're actually going to take when this test finishes. Because I see lots of people run tests and then nothing actually changes as a result of them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it's because, I mean, I have a million questions and I would love to know the answer to all of them, but everything has a cost, right? Even with automation and AI, there is a cost to every question that you ask or whatever. I'd like to think the costs to some of those things are going down over time, which is great, but there is still a cost, and it's still you're directing attention from someone or someone's or some platform even away from something to that. So is that thing that you're directing attention away from or to, is that as strategic as the thing that it was pointed to previously? So it's all, there's you've got to map it all out, or else, yeah, you're just asking a bunch of questions that are nice to know the answers to, but don't move the needle.
I think you said the word speed. Agile quite often gets lumped in with going faster, right? But I don't think that's necessarily true. So why is pace, why is speed alone kind of the wrong goal of Agile?
Back to the one point about the tests need a certain amount of time to run, but also, yeah, it's not simply about speed. I mean, I think we can be really fast, but incoherent as an organization. Everybody can be running, but they're not running in the same directions or things like that. And so, speed alone is actually could lead to greater chaos. And I've been thinking a lot about that in particular, working on a book about this concept as well, is just this idea of the speed is never going to go away. Like the world's, they've been saying this for decades and probably centuries at this point. Things are not getting any slower, right? So things will only increase, but that's the speed at which the world moves, the speed at which your organization moves. There's got to be everybody moving in the same direction at the same pace, not necessarily moving as fast as every individual can, or else again, it's chaos. It's incoherence as an organization.
I remember watching an engineering video about the Spotify model, and it was one of these hand-drawn videos, and it was great, but they have a chart about autonomy and alignment, and you need them both, right? And as you've just said, it's great to empower everyone and let them go and work the way that they want to do, but if they're not aligned and they all run in different directions, you're not going to get there at the end, and so you need to balance the autonomy and the alignment.
I mean, that can feel limiting or that can feel slow, but if everybody, you have to lowest common denominator. You've all got to be moving, at the same speed. So some practice areas within a business need to, like legal needs to move slower than the rest of the organization often. And again, that's as a marketer, as a business owner, so on and so forth, that can be annoying, right? Because, an entrepreneur wants to move at the speed of light all the time, but sometimes you need regulations and other things like that to, or else they're at least needed. And so you've got to factor them in.
So do you tend to differentiate between, agile with the capital A and the manifesto and those things versus, agility?
Yeah, definitely. And I think what I've also experienced is there are some people that are, I have some agile like Scrum certifications and things like that. I think it's helpful. I train teams. I work as a coach sometimes for teams. I've met Agile certified folks that are very, very rigid in their definition of how these things go. And, I've spoken with others that have been successful at very large organizations, some smaller organizations. They have all told me, and I've experienced this too, is there is no one way to do this. So I think there's, I look at, there's the Agile manifesto, there's an Agile marketing manifesto as well. I look at those things as guidelines, as principles of, and I think all of those things hold true. Not all of them apply to every practice area. Some of the Agile manifesto things are more targeted towards software development. So, they don't apply as much to CX or to marketing or other areas. But I think overall those principles apply. And so, I like to take those into whatever I do. But then there is what I would say dogmatic, a Scrum team has to have, this many, these roles, and a retrospective has to last for this many minutes. And, again, those are guidelines, and I've used some of those to the letter. And then I've had other cases where that didn't work. But, so I think agility with a lowercase a is just, let's try to apply some of those principles and let's do our best to do that. But let's also do what makes sense. Because I think maybe that's an unwritten rule in all of those manifestos is if some of these things don't directly apply, just use your head, like do what makes sense for the org. And then, when that's been done, I've seen Agile practices last a lot longer in organizations. When there's a very rigid approach, it doesn't last. You have a few very dogmatic people that are, they're preaching the Agile manifesto and Scrum and all this stuff, and then those people leave, and then it all falls apart. So, a more flexible, maybe a more agile approach to Agile is the recipe.
So you talked about customer experience and marketing. You've worked with and advised people across kind of retail, healthcare, finance, lots of different verticals. What is it about organizations that helps them understand how to create great customer experiences?
I think the first step was mapping across all of the teams what the customer is experiencing. And that sounds like a very simple thing. Journey mapping, we've been doing this for years. You'd be surprised how many organizations haven't updated their view of that journey in a few months, years even. And, I've worked with some pretty large ones. I think the other part is not making your customers experience your org chart. And this is, I started, my career building websites, and, that was one of our UX things that we had to coach all of our customers on is like, it doesn't matter what your org chart looks like. Your customers need to be able to navigate a website. That was one single channel, one single experience, but it was always something that we had to kind of discuss. And again, even with pretty sophisticated brands. So, think about that from the omni-channel customer now. And I think all organizations know this. Like intellectually, they know that they can't be siloed. And, we've been talking about silos and all this stuff for years, but it's one thing to say it and to put it in a PowerPoint. It's another thing to actually make it happen and actually make it seamless. And so what I find myself doing is really there's two main barriers to this. And one is the people and the processes that are siloed. They have different incentive structures and competing priorities and things like that. And the second is data. And, particularly with AI, I think the race to adopt AI is making the data silos just readily apparent. I mean, they were always there, but right now they are front and center. And so I find myself either working on, hey, how do our processes need to shift so that teams are, even if they continue to be technically siloed in an org chart, how do they work together better? And then, second is, how do we get the data from over here that this team's been working with so that this other team sitting over here can access it and their platforms can access it? So until those are solved, an organization can't truly be, customer centric and really provide that seamless experience.
So are both of those things as easy, hard as each other to get right? The data and the people and processes, or is where would you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're both as easy or as hard to your point. Neither very easy. I think traditionally people think of the more technical things like data or even or platforms as the more difficult thing. I think behavior change is the more difficult thing to sustain from a data or even a platform. There's the concept of the three-legged stool, people, process, platform. I like to add a fourth leg to that, which is data, just because I think it's such an important part of this. Once you make the data integrations, they're done, for in a manner of speaking. I mean, there's always going to be new things to add and new integrations to have, perhaps, but once a platform is implemented, once data is integrated, it's there. I think on the people side of things, it's hard to get new behaviors or good behaviors to stick. And I think that's where, even going back to the Agile conversation, you can get some people that are very strict about, we got to follow these processes, but then people do it for a little while and then they go back to their old behaviors because they like it better. It's easier for whatever reason. So, that I think the behavior change, it takes a lot of time and it takes careful planning to do it and do it in a way that's going to sustain.
I fully agree. And people get more emotional, I feel, about particularly about teams and structures and who do I report into and who's my manager and things. Whereas I think you said earlier something about it doesn't necessarily need to be a reorganization, but it's about who you go to work with, right? If you can kind of embed that, yes, I know that you work for that guy and you work for that person, but day to day, you just need to work together more closely and find your own way of doing stuff.
Yeah. And I think doing the data integration, the platform integration better and doing it from not only from an end customer perspective, but an employee and internal perspective, making those processes from a technical standpoint better can also help the behavior change and make people feel better about the change. So they work together, but again, not that data integration is easy. I mean, I've just come off a 9 month engagement on something like that for a very large organization. nothing about it was easy, but it's done now, and so now the behavior change needs to take hold and stuff like that.
So we've kind of been talking about the theory of agility. Are you able to maybe bring it to life with an example from your consulting work? Tell us about a time where you embedded agility or improved agility in it, and it led to a real measurable outcome.
Yeah, sure. And without naming names, I can talk about definitely. I was brought in to work with an e-commerce team at a retail brand that they had not been doing any agile practices at all. So they had very very siloed teams, even within their space, which e-commerce part of small part of a much larger organization. But I was brought in to first work with them to figure out, in this case, they wanted to adopt Scrum, and, does this even make sense for them? I think because, again, trying to fit the wrong process onto onto the wrong team is not going to yield the best results. But, it turns out there were a lot of things that they were doing where just some small shifts enabled them to think a little bit differently. They actually found the idea of they weren't coming together at certain points where they really needed to. So the idea of building a team that met consistently, talked about things, and then there was some autonomy still, but they worked together. They started moving towards a sprint-based model, and all of a sudden, well, maybe not all of a sudden, a few months later, after working through this, they found that they were delivering more in a shorter amount of time because they were continuously delivering things instead of this kind of stop-start mode of, okay, we've got this campaign here. Everything was being treated as a very different and very unique thing, when working together as a team in a sprint-based model actually allowed them to try to figure out, okay, well, what are the similar things what's similar about all of these things that we do, and how can we start standardizing those? And then, the other thing they were able to figure out is what they should be focused on or could focus on that actually benefited from some extra time. The creative, the strategy, the customer specific angles of all of these things. And so again, within 3 to 6 months, they were actually able to deliver an additional campaign per quarter than they had been, doing originally. And, that's a huge win. Now they're able to test one more thing and get results from one more thing to improve and be better.
Great. And then was all of that just through, process and ways of working, or are there any kind of technology tool elements to it as well?
In that case, it was really just process. And, they're always adopting new tools and changing things and everything like that. But it was really just changing the way that they work together.
And do you find that's often the case, or are there ever times that, find there are tools out there, Trello boards and process management stuff that also helps?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time when I'm brought in, it's because there's a new platform or technology or something that's being adopted. So I will say I'm maybe a little biased, or my experience is a little, that one case that I used, that's really one of the few that I was really just brought in to change the process alone, without any other platform adoption. But yeah, most of the time there's some decision made whether we're going all in on a larger platform, or sometimes they're building their own internal platforms, and I'm brought in to help an organization figure out, okay, well, we used to do this way, things this way with these 3 different platforms. Now we're moving to these 2. What does each team need to do differently? And ideally, how can we do it better? And that's what I'm often brought into. So, I would say in my experience, definitely they both kind of go hand in hand, but it can happen without.
Do you ever struggle to get people to buy in to the need for the shift? Particularly in the process space.
Yes,
How do you get around that?
I mean, there's always the people that are very much like, yeah, this needs to change, totally on board with the change. There's some that are, cautiously optimistic, or like, I'll wait and see. And then there's some that are just dug in, entrenched, and this is terrible. Like, why are you changing my job? The things worked fine, and so on and so forth. So you just kind of have to learn to work with all of them, and you can't ignore, you can't roll your eyes at the skeptics or the people that are dug in. Like, they have real, talking with them, and this is where it really helps to have one-on-ones with people to really understand. Like, I've worked with some pretty challenging situations, but talking with them, there were some really, really good reasons why they were dug into the current way of doing things. And in some cases, I'll say they weren't even against change at all, but they were against the change as they perceived it. And so part of it is, in some cases, there's the ability to modify things a little bit and make it a little more palatable. Sometimes there's not. But understanding and empathizing, that's where, we humans are still needed here. I don't think we can get AI to do some of this stuff at least anytime soon, is understanding, figuring out what the actual challenges are and working through those. And in some cases, you're going to have to tell somebody, hey, sorry, I get it, but this is still going to have to change. Other times you're going to say, that's really good feedback. I'm going to bring that to the team, and let's figure out how to solve at least part of this. And sometimes I think people just like that they've been listened to, and they get a little more on board with it. And some just, they're skeptics by nature. They need to see it work, and they're dug in at first, but then once they start using it, they're like, oh yeah, okay, I could see how this could work. So it takes all kinds, right?
You've mentioned AI. Obviously, we have to go. Every podcast is going to talk about AI at some point, right? So are you seeing AI already changing how businesses operate, and do you think it's going to improve how agile businesses can be?
Yeah, I mean, AI is part of every conversation that I have. I think it is changing. I think it's making some positive impacts on how people spend their time and what they're able to do. There is still a lot to be discovered. There's a lot to be worked out. There's a lot of, in most of the organizations I work with, they're larger organizations. They have pretty detailed AI policies in place. All of those are, there for a good reason. Some of those restrict what employees are able to do and how they're able to do it. And, there's certain sanctioned tools that the teams can use. So depending on what those tools are, kind of depends on how much their employees can gain from AI. But, it's in every conversation. It's in almost everyone that I work with is using it in some way. I think we're in a phase. The first phase was experimenting, and everyone was experimenting and just throwing a bunch of stuff on the wall, see what sticks. I think we're moving out of that. There's still some organizations that are doing that, but those organizations that are still purely experimenting are already behind. So what I'm seeing is experiments are still happening, but we're getting into a more mature phase where there's some standardized ways that AI is being used across processes. And, there's already talks, and, we've seen some very public layoffs and talk about reducing headcounts and stuff. I would say the most common scenario that I've experienced is freezing hiring, like freezing new positions and things like that. I think in the best case scenario, we won't reduce too many more jobs, but we're probably not adding new headcount, for any foreseeable time, because AI can do so much. So now a lot of it is, okay, well, how can we get our teams using these tools better so that they can do all the stuff that they weren't able to get to? Because I don't think that, I mean, I know there's been very public, job reductions and things like that. Any teams that I work with, they have 80 hours a week of work to do. They just only have 40 hours or, maybe a little more to do it in. And so AI helps them with that, reduce that 80 hours to maybe 40 hours. And so they're actually now able to get their jobs done. And so I think I see enough positive in it. I think there's still some reckoning with layoffs. And I think there's a reckoning after that where companies are going to bring people back when they realize they cut too many. And AI is really good at some things, but not at all the things that it was kind of sold for.
Yeah, indeed. Do you think there's any areas that businesses are overestimating what AI can do? Certainly, maybe at this point in time, I think we know it's moving fast, right? But right now, is there any areas that it's overpromising and under-delivering?
Yeah, I mean, I think and some of this comes down to the data silos and some of the other things. Just connecting too many dots right now is just, there's some amazing tools that I've seen demos of that are able, in theory, to do great, end-to-end campaigns and, from start to finish, all this stuff. But seeing it actually happen in practice, it's okay, in most cases. And that's not even necessarily the AI's fault, but whatever the fault, whether it's things are not connected properly or connected enough, or a tool was built with this ideal scenario in mind that didn't actually factor in how companies are actually structured and work. Be that, whatever the case is, I think we're being a little oversold on how much just pure end-to-end automation is going to happen. As well as on the customer side, I do see customer agents being a big thing that starts happening sooner, soon and more so. But there are still going to be customers that don't want to do that and that want a seamless, they want as good and seamless as an experience as someone who types into Claude and is like, hey, buy me a pair of socks and I want them tomorrow. There's going to be the same people that want to manually, whether it's walk into the store or go onto a site and have the same type of experience. So they don't take things away, like print advertising and TV advertising is still very much alive. Like they don't take things away. They just keep adding more. And the more now is this agentic stuff. But the other stuff doesn't go away.
Moving on to you then, I think you've written close to 20 books now. How do you decide what it is that you want to write about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think whatever possessed me to write the first several, I just kind of I always like to learn, and I found writing as a way to help me learn and just organize my thoughts about stuff. And then I decided, okay, well, if I'm going to write a few articles about this, why don't I just put together a book about it? And, so I just kind of started down that path. But yeah, I mean, I tend to write about what I'm focused on, what I'm experiencing, what I'm focused on, in my work. I mean, I have the podcast and I write and stuff, but I pride myself on also getting my hands dirty and, doing the consulting work and actually being involved in these projects. And I feel like that gives me a perspective on things in a real world scenario. And so, I'll experience something and maybe see a trend or something that I want to dig into a little bit more and then see, oh, okay, well, I don't think a lot of people have tackled it from this angle. And then, soon enough, I have a book outline together and then I'm off to the races, so to speak. So, right now, the thing that I'm focused on is just this idea of maintaining organizational coherence at speed. And so, I'm working on something around that now, because I see it as, to your earlier question and point, it's not just about speed. If that's the only goal we have, we're just going to have chaos. And as things fragment and new things continue to get added to the mix, we risk, just this very fast, very incoherent chaos as an organization and from the customer perspective. So yeah, things like that just get in my head, and I just want to get it out.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you work in an area that's constantly evolving, right? Does that make it easier to write more about, or does it make it harder because you almost outdating yourself sometimes?
Yeah, it is kind of, on the one hand, it's a little crazy to think about writing books, and I think what I write about and how I write about them has changed over time as well. And so, I do a few different things. So I do try to think about what is a bigger theme that's not going to date itself as much anymore. And that's definitely been a challenge, particularly over the last few years. I mean, I feel like really I think one of the downsides of AI is that because it's so much easier to create content, a lot more people are creating a lot of content, and it's not necessarily, it may be original content, but it's not as original ideas or takes on the topics. And so I am a lot more careful about that. So that's definitely something that I factor in. And some of those things that I feel like deserve a book, but maybe, I write a series, or I kind of, at this point, I get other people to collaborate on series with me of Agile Brand guides is what they're called, on just topics like platform topics and things like that. So I get a bunch of people to contribute chapters on, I did one on e-commerce, for instance, last year, and got a bunch of people to write chapters for it. And, I know that within a year or two, it's going to need an update, but they're built by design to do that. So, every couple of years, I'm going to update them. But other topics, I'm trying to think more, timeless. It probably is over, I wish, but it was, but, more timeless. Let's just put it that way.
So to close out, I mean, you're a customer yourself, as we all are, of many brands. Are there any brands out there that you could give an example where you feel they've been genuinely agile in how they've served you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm very loyal to a few brands, and some of that is I'm stubbornly loyal, and some of that is they've earned my loyalty. A few that I'll mention that maybe fall in the latter camp. I mean, I think American Express is certainly one, and that I've been an early adopter of some of their products before, and actually appreciated some. Just like my my cable company just notified me that there was an internet outage or whatever, but they've worked with me very collaboratively, you could say, on new ideas and better ways of working and stuff like that. So, there's ones like that, and just others. Marriott is another brand that I am pretty loyal to, and has, I've had issue, everybody has travel issues, right? So it's, if you travel enough, you're going to have an issue, right? But, been very adaptive to some of the things that I've needed or things like that. And so, I think some of that just comes from, some types of industries just have, I think the hospitality industry in particular has been thinking about customer experience in a deeper way than some other brands and industries have, but still the ability to adapt and continue to learn about their customers and adapt experiences for individual customers, I think is still I'm still delighted by that.
And if you had to leave our listeners or our viewers with just 3 essential takeaways in 30 seconds from this episode, what would they be?
Yeah, I think there's a key difference between agility and speed, and I think it's important to understand that. And I think to understand the difference between why change can be difficult and breaking that down between the people, the process, and the data and the platform components of that is incredibly important, and will help you actually be more successful. And I think the last thing would just be organizations need to stop thinking in terms of their org chart when they're trying to make a customer experience, and really think, instead of inside out, think outside in.
Totally agree. Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, Greg. It's been great having you as a guest. Thank you for joining us on the CX Equation.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
The CX Equation is brought to you by TapCXM. To find out more about what we do and how we can help you, visit tapcxm.com.
And then make sure to search for the CX Equation in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you usually find your podcasts. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes.
On behalf of the team here at TapCXM, thank you for listening.